Number 1. Carly Gregg. A 14-year-old girl walks calmly into her mother's bedroom, raises a .38 caliber revolver, and fires. Then she picks up her mother's phone and texts her stepfather 3 words that will lure him home to die next. This is not a movie. This happened in a quiet brick house in Brandon, Mississippi, and the entire thing was captured on the family's own kitchen security camera. The date was March the 19th, 2024, a Tuesday like any other in Rankin County. Ashley Smiley, 40 years old, was a beloved mathematics teacher at Northwest Rankin High School, the kind of teacher former students still tag in old class photos years later. She had built a blended family with her husband, Heath Smiley, 39 years old, and she had 2 daughters, one from an earlier chapter of her life who had already passed away, and Carly Madison Gregg, born in April of 2009, who by March of 2024 was 14 years old and, on the surface, an ordinary freshman. Investigators would later piece together that on that Tuesday afternoon, Carly retrieved a .38 caliber revolver, a firearm that had belonged to her late grandfather and had been given to her mother, and walked into Ashley's bedroom. She shot her mother multiple times. Ashley Smiley died in her own home, in the house where she had raised her children, on an ordinary weekday afternoon. What happened next is what turned this case from a tragedy into a true crime sensation that would be discussed on national television for over a year. Rather than fleeing, rather than calling for help, prosecutors say Carly picked up her mother's phone and texted Heath Smiley, asking when he would be arriving home. It appeared, according to testimony later given in court, to be an attempt to lure her stepfather into the house so that she could ambush him as well. When Heath Smiley walked through the door that evening, Carly allegedly fired at him too, the bullet grazing his shoulder rather than striking a fatal blow. Heath survived. He would later have to sit in a courtroom and testify against his stepdaughter about the day his wife was murdered and his own life was nearly taken. But the detail that made this case explode across social media and cable news was what happened in between the 2 shootings. According to testimony and court records, Carly did not simply wait quietly for her stepfather to come home. She invited a friend over. She showed that friend her mother's body. The family's home security system, the same modest camera system meant to catch package thieves or watch the front porch, had captured the entire sequence from inside the kitchen. When that footage was played in the Rankin County Courthouse in Brandon during the trial, it did not stay contained to the jury box. Clips and descriptions spread rapidly online, transforming what might have been a regional tragedy into one of the most discussed true crime cases of the year. Search engines lit up with people typing in queries just to see stills from that footage, trying to understand how a teenage girl could appear so unbothered in the minutes after killing her own mother. The investigation moved with unusual speed. Carly was arrested and charged as an adult with murder, attempted murder, and tampering with evidence, the tampering charge stemming from allegations that she moved or hid the very security camera that had recorded her. She was indicted within roughly 2 months of the killing and brought to trial within about 6 months, an extraordinarily fast timeline for a case involving competing theories of mental illness, family history, and forensic evidence. Rankin County Circuit Judge Dewey Arthur presided, and when Carly's defense later appealed, her new attorneys would point to this speed as one of several reasons the trial had been unfair to a girl who was only 14 at the time of the shooting. At trial, Carly's defense attorney, Kevin Camp, did not dispute that she pulled the trigger. Instead, the defense entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, arguing that Carly had been in the grip of a severe mental health crisis at the moment of the shooting, and that a life sentence would only compound the tragedy for a family that had already lost so much. Prosecutor Catherine Newman pushed back hard, telling the jury that Carly had shown no remorse for what she had done and that she had known exactly what she was doing when she pulled that trigger. The trial lasted 5 days. Spectators packed the Rankin County Courthouse, and cameras carried gavel-to-gavel coverage to a national true crime audience that had, by that point, been following the case for months. On September the 20th, 2024, the jury returned its verdict after a relatively brief deliberation: guilty on all counts, murder in the first degree, attempted murder, and tampering with evidence. When the verdict was read, Carly broke down sobbing at the defense table, and her attorney, Bridget Todd, moved to comfort her as she was led out of the courtroom. The sentencing phase moved almost as quickly as the trial itself. The jury deliberated for a matter of hours before determining that Carly Gregg would be sentenced to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, to run concurrently with an additional 10-year sentence for the evidence tampering charge. Before the trial, prosecutors had reportedly offered Carly a plea deal that would have resulted in a 40-year sentence. She turned it down, choosing instead to fight the case at trial and gamble on the insanity defense. That gamble did not pay off. The aftermath of the sentencing produced one of the more remarkable courtroom exchanges of the whole saga. As the verdict was read, family members present offered words of comfort to Carly even as they mourned Ashley. The community of Brandon, a suburb of Jackson that had never experienced this kind of scrutiny before, found itself at the center of a national conversation about teenage violence, mental illness, and whether children who kill should ever be given a chance at freedom. The story did not end with the sentencing. Weeks later, Carly's defense filed a motion for a new trial, arguing that new evidence had emerged that could have changed the outcome, and that witnesses favorable to Carly had been improperly excluded from testifying. Prosecutor Newman fired back in her own filing, arguing bluntly that simply disliking the result of a trial is not grounds to get a new one. In October of that year, Judge Arthur denied the motion, ruling that the jury's verdict was not against the weight of the evidence that included the security footage, eyewitness testimony, statements Carly had allegedly made against her own interest, DNA evidence, gunshot residue, and ballistics. Carly's team did not stop there. They appealed the conviction and sentence directly to the Mississippi Supreme Court. Her new lead appellate attorney, James Murphy, argued that Carly's sentencing hearing had failed to meet the strict constitutional standards required when sentencing a minor to life without parole, standards rooted in the United States Supreme Court's landmark 2012 ruling in Miller v. Alabama, which held that mandatory life sentences for children are unconstitutional. Murphy argued that the sentencing phase in Carly's case had been rushed and inadequate, consisting of little more than the judge announcing the jury's verdict. He also pointed to a specific moment during the prosecution's closing argument at sentencing, in which prosecutors told jurors they might one day encounter Carly again at church or out in public. Rhetoric, the defense argued, was designed to inflame the jury's fears rather than focus on the legal standard. During oral arguments before the state's highest court, one justice pushed back on the defense's framing, questioning aloud whether the sentence Carly received was technically life without the possibility of parole at all, or simply life, given some ambiguity in the wording of the original sentencing order. The distinction matters immensely in Mississippi law. As of July 1, 2024, just weeks before Carly's crime, state law changed to make a true sentence of life without parole illegal for a juvenile offender unless specifically imposed by a jury following the proper constitutional framework. Whether Carly's sentence complies with that framework, or whether it must be reduced to a sentence with the possibility of parole after a term of years, remains before the Mississippi Supreme Court as of this recording. For now, Carly Gregg remains in the custody of the Mississippi Department of Corrections, serving 2 life sentences for the murder of her mother and the attempted murder of her stepfather, a case that began with a teenager and a revolver in a quiet Brandon bedroom, and ended up rewriting how an entire online audience thinks about family, mental illness, and the limits of forgiveness. Number 2. Nikita Kassap. Picture a 17-year-old boy driving across 7 states with his parents' decomposing bodies left behind him in their own house, and a manifesto in his pocket describing a plan to assassinate the President of the United States. This is one of the strangest and most disturbing teen crime stories of the decade, and it started with a welfare check nobody expected to end in tragedy. In the town of Waukesha, Wisconsin, 17-year-old Nikita Kassap lived with his mother, 35-year-old Tatiana Kassap, and his stepfather, 51-year-old Donald Meyer. On the surface, nothing seemed unusual about the household. Then, in late February of 2025, a resource officer at Nikita's school noticed the teenager had been absent for 2 full weeks, a stark contrast to what had previously been described as near-perfect attendance. Around the same time, Donald Meyer's own mother grew worried after being unable to reach the family, and she called the Waukesha County Sheriff's Department and asked for a welfare check. What deputies found inside that home on February 20th, 2025, would shock even hardened investigators. Tatiana Kassap was discovered in a hallway, her body covered with blankets and a towel, her face blackened from advanced decomposition, with dried blood pooled around her on the floor. Days later, on February 28th, during the execution of a search warrant, investigators located Donald Meyer's body as well, hidden beneath a pile of clothing in a first-floor office. According to the criminal complaint, Nikita had been living inside that house with his parents' decaying bodies for approximately 2 weeks before he finally fled. And flee is exactly what he did, in dramatic fashion. Neighbors reported seeing Nikita driving Meyer's Volkswagen Atlas alone in the days before the bodies were found, along with the family's small black dog. Cell phone location data would later show his device leaving Waukesha on February 24th and traveling an extraordinary distance across multiple states. Surveillance footage from a massive truck stop in Iowa, one of the largest in the country, captured the Volkswagen Atlas passing through with a single occupant believed to be Nikita and the family dog riding along. Investigators tracked the vehicle's path through Illinois, Nebraska, and Colorado before Nikita was finally stopped and taken into custody after running a stop sign in a small town in Kansas, more than 800 miles from his Waukesha home. Inside the vehicle at the time of his arrest, officers found his stepfather's Smith & Wesson .38 caliber Magnum revolver, both victims' driver's licenses, and spent shell casings. He was initially charged only with operating a motor vehicle without the owner's consent and theft, charges that seemed almost mundane compared to what investigators would soon uncover. Within days, as the true scope of the crime became clear, prosecutors filed far more serious charges: 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, 2 counts of hiding a corpse, theft of property exceeding $10,000, and additional counts related to misappropriating identification to obtain money. But the story took an even darker and stranger turn as federal investigators began combing through Nikita's electronic devices. What they found led the FBI to describe this as far more than a case of a troubled teenager killing his parents for money. According to court documents unsealed as part of a federal search warrant, investigators discovered material connected to an extremist neo-Nazi network known as the Order of Nine Angles, along with a self-authored manifesto discussing plans to assassinate President Donald Trump, build explosive devices, and carry out acts of domestic terrorism. Federal authorities alleged that Nikita had purchased a drone and explosive materials, and that he had been in contact with other individuals, including a Russian-speaking associate, about a broader plot to overthrow the United States government. The federal search warrant made a chilling connection explicit. Investigators wrote that the killing of his parents appeared to be an effort by Nikita to obtain the financial means and independence necessary to carry out this larger plan. In other words, according to the allegations, Tatiana Kassap and Donald Meyer were not killed in a spontaneous fit of rage, but as a calculated first step toward funding an assassination plot. Federal court documents also indicated that other parties who had been in contact with Nikita appeared to be aware of what he intended to do and may have assisted him in carrying it out. The case immediately drew intense national attention, given the extraordinary combination of a double parricide, a cross-country manhunt, and an alleged presidential assassination plot tied to extremist ideology. Nikita appeared in Waukesha County Circuit Court for a preliminary hearing in early April of 2025, still not yet having entered a plea, as both state prosecutors and federal authorities pursued their own separate charges, including potential federal counts for conspiracy, presidential assassination, and use of weapons of mass destruction. For months, the case moved through a complicated dual-track legal process, with the state homicide case in Waukesha County proceeding alongside the looming federal investigation. Then, in January of 2026, by which point Nikita had turned 18, he appeared once more in Waukesha County Circuit Court and pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide in the deaths of his mother and stepfather. As part of the negotiated agreement, prosecutors dropped 7 additional charges, including the counts related to hiding the corpses and theft. Each homicide count carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison, though the presiding judge, Ralph Ramirez, retained discretion over whether Nikita would ever become eligible for parole after serving a minimum of 20 years on each count. The formal sentencing hearing took place in early March of 2026. Nikita Kassap, by then 18 years old, was sentenced to life in prison for the murders of his mother and stepfather, a plan federal investigators say he carried out specifically to fund a much larger and more horrifying ambition. The case remains one of the most unusual entries on this list, not simply because of the brutality of the killings or the audacity of the cross-country flight, but because of what investigators allege was the true motive behind it all: not anger, not inheritance in the ordinary sense, but an attempt to bankroll an act of political violence against the President of the United States. Number 3. Christopher Atkins. He was only 12 years old, an age when most kids are still worrying about middle school homework, when he allegedly pulled the trigger on a teenage girl locked in the trunk of a car that was slowly sinking into a pond. This is one of the youngest offenders on this entire list, and one of the most disturbing. The case began in the rural community of Ocklawaha, Florida, a small area within Marion County east of Ocala, in the early hours of March 30th, 2023. That night, 6 teenagers who all knew one another were together, and by the time the sun rose, 3 of them would be dead. Marion County Sheriff's deputies responded to Forest Lakes Park shortly before 11 at night after reports of a shooting, and there they found 16-year-old Layla Silvernail lying unconscious near a dumpster, shot in the head. She was rushed to a local hospital in critical condition, but she would not survive her injuries. The following morning, at around 8 o'clock, deputies located the body of 17-year-old Michael Hodo Jr. on the side of a road several miles away, also shot in the head. Hodo had recently withdrawn from Lake Ware High School just 2 months before his death. Then, on April the 1st, Searchers located a third body, 16-year-old Camille Qualls, found inside the trunk of Layla Silvernail's own vehicle, a car that had been driven into a pond and left partially submerged, roughly 6 miles from where Hodo's body had been discovered. Qualls had been shot twice. Investigators say the 6 teenagers had gathered that night for what began as an armed robbery. The group reportedly tried to rob a man attempting to buy a gun from them. According to investigators, the group then turned on 3 of their own. A grand jury indicted 3 defendants that May: 19-year-old Robert Robinson and 18-year-old Taj Bruton, who were 17 and 16 at the time of the killings respectively, each on 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with armed robbery and evidence tampering charges. The third defendant was Christopher Atkins, who was only 12 years old at the time of the murders, one of the youngest individuals in the country ever charged as an adult with first-degree murder. Atkins was indicted on a single count of first-degree murder, specifically for the death of Camille Qualls, the girl found in the trunk of the submerged car. According to Marion County Sheriff Billy Woods, both Robinson and Atkins confessed to shooting Qualls. Investigators say Robinson directed Atkins, who reportedly went by the street name 35, to shoot Qualls as she rode in the trunk of Silvernail's small sedan. The premeditation involved the callous disposal of the bodies across 3 separate locations, and the use of a firearm led prosecutors to conclude that all 3 defendants, regardless of age, had acted with an intent indistinguishable from that of adults. The case moved slowly through the courts for 2 years, working toward a tentative trial date in the summer of 2025. But in April of 2025, Christopher Atkins, by then 14 years old, entered a guilty plea to all charges, agreeing to testify against his 2 co-defendants in exchange for the possibility of a lighter sentence. His plea hearing lasted less than an hour. Under Florida law, he faced a sentencing range anywhere from a minimum of 40 years up to a maximum of life in prison for the combined murder and robbery charges. In June of 2025, Robert Robinson and Taj Bruton also entered open pleas, meaning neither had a negotiated agreement guaranteeing a specific sentence, leaving their fates entirely up to the presiding judge. All 3 defendants were then scheduled for individual sentencing hearings in the same week that July. On July the 22nd, 2025, Christopher Atkins, by then 15 years old, stood before Judge Robert Hodges to learn his fate. The judge sentenced him to 40 years in prison, with credit for time already served, and with the possibility of a sentence review after 25 years. Additional concurrent sentences were imposed for armed robbery, evidence tampering, and battery. Judge Hodges noted sambly that nothing the court could do would ever undo what had been done to the 3 victims. The following day, Robert Robinson and Taj Bruton returned to the same courtroom for their own sentencing. Both men were sentenced to life in prison for their roles in the killings, with eligibility for a parole-style sentence review after 25 years, owing to their status as minors at the time of the crimes. The victims' families delivered gut-wrenching impact statements throughout the sentencing hearings. Layla Silvernail's grandmother told the court that she and her husband, already dealing with poor health, now felt the heartbreak slowly killing them from the inside, and that the pain would never stop. Michael Hodo's father told the court plainly that he believed the defendants deserved the death penalty, a sentence that was legally off the table given their ages at the time of the crimes. During earlier interrogation footage that surfaced publicly, Robinson pointed the finger at Bruton, claiming that if he had refused to go along with the plan, he too would have died that night alongside the victims. State Attorney Bill Gladson summarized the case in blunt terms after the final sentencing, stating that the convictions honored the stolen lives of Layla, Michael, and Camille while affirming that no one, regardless of age, can brutally take another person's life without facing the gravest consequences. For Marion County, a rural pocket of central Florida unaccustomed to this kind of national scrutiny, the case became a haunting symbol of how quickly ordinary teenage social dynamics can spiral into an execution-style triple homicide, and how young the hands pulling the trigger can sometimes be. Number 4. Colt Gray. 2 teachers and 2 14-year-old students never made a home from school on an ordinary Wednesday morning, and the shooter walked the halls of that Georgia high school as a fellow student, only 16 years old at the time this recording was made, and just 14 when he opened fire. On the morning of September the 4th, 2024, Apalachee High School in Winder, Georgia, a small city roughly an hour outside Atlanta in Barrow County, became the site of one of the deadliest school shootings the state has ever experienced. Colt Gray, then 14 years old, had only attended the school for a handful of days. That morning, he brought an assault-style rifle onto campus, concealed inside his backpack. According to testimony that would later emerge during a related trial, school officials and a resource officer actually attempted to intercept Colt and search his backpack that morning after receiving concerning reports. But in what investigators would later describe as a stranger-than-fiction mix-up, staff confused him with another student who shared a nearly identical name, Colton Gray, and the search never happened. Minutes later, Colt opened fire inside the school. By the time the shooting ended, 4 people were dead, 2 teachers, 39-year-old Richard Aspinwall and 53-year-old Christina Irami, and 2 14-year-old students, Mason Shermahan and Christian Angulo. 9 additional people were injured and hospitalized. The rifle used in the attack, prosecutors say, had been given to Colt as a Christmas present by his own father. That detail, a father buying his teenage son the exact weapon later used to kill 4 people at school, became the center of a second, parallel legal case that unfolded alongside Colt's own prosecution. Colt's father, 54-year-old Colin Gray, was arrested and charged in connection with the shooting, making him the first parent in Georgia history to face criminal charges tied to a school shooting allegedly carried out by his own child, and only the 3rd such prosecution of a parent in connection with a mass shooting nationwide. Prosecutors argued that Colin Gray had exhibited criminal negligence by purchasing the rifle for his son and leaving it unsecured, despite what they described as prior warnings that Colt posed a danger to others. Colin's defense argued he had been unaware of any violent plans and had actually taken steps to get his son psychological help, including bonding with him through activities like hunting and shooting at a gun range using that very weapon. In March of 2026, a jury found Colin Gray guilty on 29 total counts, including second-degree murder, involuntary manslaughter, and reckless conduct in connection with the shooting his son carried out. He is expected to be sentenced later this year. Meanwhile, Colt Gray's own case moved through the courts as prosecutors charged him as an adult with a total of 55 felony counts. For counts of malice murder, for counts of felony murder, for counts of aggravated battery, 25 counts of aggravated assault, and 18 counts of first-degree cruelty to children. Facing the possibility of up to 180 years in prison, Colt initially pleaded not guilty and demanded a jury trial. Because he was a minor at the time of the shooting, the death penalty was never a legal possibility, but prosecutors could still pursue a sentence of life in prison, with the central legal question becoming whether he would ever have a chance at parole. For more than a year, Colt remained in custody at a juvenile detention facility as his case wound through pretrial hearings. In late 2025, his defense attorneys began signaling that a change of plea might be coming, indicating they were waiting on the results of a psychological evaluation before making a final decision. The presiding judge, Nicholas Prim, eventually set a firm deadline, telling Colt's legal team that while a defendant has a constitutional right to a jury trial, there is no equivalent constitutional right to simply enter a guilty plea whenever convenient. The court needed a decision on a timeline. In a significant pretrial ruling, Judge Prim also granted a defense request to move the trial out of Barrow County entirely due to concerns about the sheer volume of pretrial publicity the case had generated, with Columbia County, Georgia, eventually selected as the new venue for jury selection, originally scheduled to begin that October. Then, just 2 days after that change of venue ruling, Colt's defense filed new court documents indicating he no longer intended to proceed to trial at all. According to court TV reporting, this would be a non-negotiated plea, meaning there was no agreement in place with prosecutors regarding what sentence he would receive. Rather than negotiating a specific outcome, Colt, now 16 years old, would be throwing himself on the mercy of the court, with prosecutors expected to argue forcefully for a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. Colt Gray is scheduled to appear in Barrow County Superior Court on July the 24th for his formal plea and sentencing hearing, just days from this recording. Whatever the outcome, the case will close one of the most devastating chapters in modern Georgia history. A 14-year-old boy, a rifle given to him by his own father, a school that failed to stop him due to a simple case of mistaken identity, and 4 lives that ended in the span of a few terrifying minutes on an otherwise ordinary Wednesday morning. Before we move to case number 5, if this kind of in-depth true crime coverage is something you value, take a second to hit that like button and drop a comment letting us know which of these cases has shocked you the most so far. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Midnight Cold Case so you don't miss what's still to come. Number 5. Sarah Grace Patrick. She spent months posting tearful TikTok videos begging for prayers and sympathy over her parents' deaths, all while investigators quietly built the case that would eventually lead to her own arrest for killing them. In the early morning hours of February the 20th, 2025, deputies in Carroll County, Georgia, a community west of Atlanta near the city of Carrollton, responded to a home in the 1500 block of Chuse Carrollton Road. Inside, they found a married couple, 41-year-old Kristen Brock and 45-year-old James Brock, shot to death as they slept in their own bed. It was their young daughter, only around 5 or 6 years old at the time, who discovered the bodies. The one who placed the frantic call to 911 that morning was Kristen's teenage daughter from a previous relationship, Sarah Grace Patrick, then 16 years old, who had been living with the couple at the time of the killings. For months, the case remained publicly unsolved, even as investigators worked quietly behind the scenes. Carroll County officials would later describe it as a relentless investigation that consumed thousands of hours and required the full weight of both local and federal law enforcement partnerships, even during stretches when the case had faded from the headlines. During those same months, Sarah Grace Patrick was active on social media, posting a series of emotional TikTok videos mourning her mother and stepfather, using captions asking followers to send prayers for healing. In one particularly chilling detail that would later draw national attention, she reportedly reached out directly to a true crime social media influencer, offering to speak on the record about the night of the murders. According to that influencer's own account, Sarah described hearing the alarm on James Brock's heart assistance medical device going off throughout the night, but claimed she heard nothing else unusual. On July the 8th, 2025, investigators finally moved. Sarah Grace Patrick, by then 17 years old, turned herself into the Carroll County Jail after being notified that arrest warrants had been issued in her name. She was initially charged with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of aggravated assault. Carroll County's communications director, Ashley Halsey, told reporters at a press conference that investigators possessed what she called mountains of evidence against the teenager, though she declined to elaborate on specifics at that time. Halsey also offered a haunting observation about Sarah's upbringing, noting that the 17-year-old had essentially been out on her own for years, having lived with a rotating cast of different family members and moved frequently from place to place. The case captured massive public attention almost immediately, driven in large part by the unsettling contrast between Sarah's public grieving online and the private accusation that she had been the one who pulled the trigger. Screenshots obtained by news outlets showed the teenager's TikTok account, complete with videos posted in the days and weeks after the killings, expressing grief for the very parents prosecutors say she murdered. As the case moved toward trial, additional and more serious charges were added. 2 counts of malice murder along with 2 weapons-related charges were tacked onto the original indictment. At an arraignment hearing, the presiding judge, Dustin Hightower, laid out an ambitious timeline aiming for a January trial date, while acknowledging that defense continuances could easily push things back, which is exactly what happened. Sarah's defense team requested and received a delay after hiring their own psychologist to conduct a mental evaluation of the teenager, a process that took months to complete. Prosecutors, in turn, asked for time to review those findings and to potentially conduct their own competing evaluation. By January of 2026, with the original trial date arriving and no final psychological report in hand, Judge Hightower reluctantly granted another continuance, warning both sides that this would be the last one he would allow, and setting a new trial date for August of that year. Throughout this process, Sarah has been repeatedly denied bond. At one bond reconsideration hearing in January of 2026, her defense attorney argued that the teenager had no prior criminal history, no driver's license, no passport, and effectively no means to flee even if released, proposing strict conditions including house arrest, ankle monitoring, a total ban on cell phone and social media use, and no contact whatsoever with witnesses or the Brock family. Prosecutors strongly objected, and family members of the victims testified about their fear for their own safety should Sarah be released, with James Brock's sister specifically telling the court she feared for her safety if Sarah were allowed out of custody. The judge ultimately sided with the prosecution, citing ongoing concerns about flight risk, the possibility of witness intimidation, and the safety of the broader community. Sarah has remained held in solitary confinement since her arrest, a detail her attorneys have raised as a point of concern given her age. Court filings that later became public painted an even more complicated picture of the household Sarah grew up in. Records revealed that back in August of 2022, well before the murders, Kristen Brock had actually been charged with attempting to run over James Brock with a car while a child was riding in the backseat. James had filed a protective order at the time, alleging physical abuse, threats, and interference with his ability to call for emergency help, though he dismissed that protective order just 3 weeks later. The couple went on to marry in December of 2023, roughly 14 months before both of them were found shot dead in their bed. Testimony from Sarah's bond hearings also described a girl who reportedly apologized for basic requests like asking for food or using the bathroom, and a best friend who testified she had never once been allowed inside Sarah's home in years of friendship. Prosecution filings additionally revealed that security cameras had been installed inside Sarah's own bedroom at some point, and that those cameras were removed sometime before the killings, a detail defense attorneys and true crime commentators alike have seized on as potentially significant, though its full relevance has not yet been explained in open court. As of this recording, Sarah Grace Patrick remains in custody awaiting an August 2026 trial date, charged as an adult with malice murder in the deaths of her mother and stepfather, a case that has transfixed true crime audiences precisely because of the unsettling gap between a grieving daughter's public performance of loss and the private accusation of exactly what she is alleged to have done. Number 6. Carmelo Anthony. A single knife, a crowded high school track meet, and one moment of chaos under a rain-soaked bleacher tent turned two 17-year-old boys' futures upside down, one buried, and one now facing decades behind bars. The killing happened on the morning of April 2, 2025, at David Kuykendall Stadium on the campus of Memorial High School in Frisco, Texas, during a track and field meet involving multiple area schools. Austin Metcalf, a 17-year-old junior at Memorial High School, was by every account a standout. He held a nearly perfect grade point average, played as the MVP linebacker on the school's football team, and competed in track and field as well. That morning, he was in the stands with teammates gathered beneath a tent reserved for Memorial High School students and families, a common and unremarkable arrangement at high school track meets across the state. Carmelo Anthony, also 17 at the time, attended a different school, Centennial High School, but had made his way under the memorial tent that rainy morning, which witnesses described as a fairly typical and socially loose situation at these kinds of meets, where students from different schools often mingled beneath whichever shelter was nearby. According to witness testimony given at trial, Austin and others asked Carmelo to leave the tent multiple times, and the situation escalated from there. One witness recalled Austin telling Carmelo bluntly that he had nothing of consequence in his backpack, framing the exchange almost as a challenge given their location in Frisco. According to a police report cited at trial, Carmelo reportedly reached into his bag and told the other teens to touch him and see what would happen. Moments later, in what one teenage witness described to a detective as looking like a push or a punch, a physical altercation broke out. In that instant, Carmelo Anthony stabbed Austin Metcalf. Austin died from his injuries at the scene, in front of teammates, coaches, and family members who had gathered that morning simply to watch a track meet. Carmelo turned himself into authorities shortly after the stabbing and was charged with first-degree murder. He entered a plea of not guilty, and his defense built its entire case around a claim of self-defense, arguing that Texas law does not require someone to wait until they are physically struck before acting to protect themselves, and that in the split-second chaos of the moment, Austin's actions gave Carmelo no legal right to put his hands on him. Because both teenagers were minors at the time of the killing, and because the circumstances did not meet the specific legal threshold for capital murder, the death penalty was never on the table in this case regardless of the outcome. The case exploded into the national spotlight almost immediately, driven in large part by the racial dynamic between the two teenagers. Carmelo is black, and Austin was white, with viral social media posts amplifying the killing along racial lines and fundraising campaigns springing up on both sides. The case became a lightning rod for online debate that, at times, had little to do with the actual facts being argued inside the Collin County Courthouse in Kinney, Texas. Jury selection finally began on June 1, 2026, more than a year after the killing. A jury was seated 2 days later, and opening statements followed on June 4. Over the course of what would become a nearly week-long trial, prosecutors, led by attorney Werski, argued forcefully that this was not a case of self-defense at all, but plain and simple murder, asserting that Carmelo had been the aggressor who provoked the confrontation. Defense attorney Mike Howard countered that Austin had no legal right to physically confront Carmelo over something as trivial as standing under the wrong tent, urging jurors to imagine themselves in his client's shoes during that split second of chaos. The prosecution rested its case on June 6, and the defense immediately began calling its own witnesses. Notably, Carmelo did not take the stand in his own defense at any point during the trial. After roughly a week of testimony, the case went to the jury, which deliberated for approximately 3 hours before returning its verdict on June 9, 2026, guilty of murder. Jurors had also been given the option to convict on the lesser charge of manslaughter, which under Texas law is defined as recklessly causing a death, as opposed to murder, defined as knowingly or intentionally causing one, a distinction jurors rejected in favor of the more serious charge. During the trial's separate punishment phase, only one witness took the stand on Carmelo's behalf, his own mother, Kayla Hayes, who tearfully asked the jury for mercy, telling them that regardless of what had happened, Carmelo would always be her oldest child and her baby. The jury deliberated further before ultimately sentencing him to 35 years in prison, declining to find that the killing had resulted from sudden passion, which could have reduced the sentence range. Following the sentencing decision, Austin Metcalf's parents and his twin brother delivered emotional victim impact statements directly to Camelo. The case has continued to generate controversy even after sentencing. In a widely criticized moment following the verdict, Austin's father, Jeff Metcalf, used a racially charged phrase referring to Camelo during a podcast appearance, language that was broadly condemned as invoking a racist stereotype, even as Metcalf simultaneously stated that he forgave Camelo and did not want to carry hatred and anger for the rest of his life. Separately, Camelo's defense team has since filed documents seeking a new trial, alleging that prosecutors broke what defense attorneys describe as a handshake agreement that would have narrowed the scope of the trial strictly to the minutes surrounding the stabbing itself, and that Camelo's legal team was given only about 10 minutes to decide whether he should testify after that agreement allegedly fell apart. As of this recording, Camelo Anthony, now 19 years old, is serving a 35-year sentence for the murder of Austin Metcalf, a case born from an argument over a tent at a rainy high school track meet, and one that ballooned into one of the most racially charged and closely watched teen murder trials in recent American memory. Number 7. Daniel Michael Keogh. A 30-year-old gas station worker, alone behind the counter on an ordinary shift, never saw the shotgun coming, and the boy who pulled the trigger was only 15 years old. The case centers on the small town of Toledo, Washington, located in Lewis County, where 30-year-old Navjot Singh worked as an employee at a local Shell station. In 2023, Singh became the victim of what prosecutors would describe as a calculated armed robbery gone fatal, carried out by a trio of teenagers: 15-year-old Daniel Keogh, 17-year-old Quinton Rami, and 16-year-old Taylor Lenihan. According to Keogh's own later guilty plea statement, he entered the Shell station carrying a shotgun with the explicit intent of robbing the store, pointed the weapon at the employee working that shift, and in the course of that robbery, shot and killed Navjot Singh, a man who had no part whatsoever in the crime being committed against him. Court documents would later reveal that Keogh and Rami were already suspects in a separate armed robbery that had occurred in Florence, Oregon, just days before Singh's murder, suggesting a pattern of escalating criminal behavior in the days leading up to the killing. All three teenagers were eventually arrested and charged in connection with the Toledo murder. Taylor Lenihan, the youngest of the three at just 16 at the time, pleaded guilty shortly after her arrest in May of 2023 to charges of first-degree attempted robbery and accomplice liability related to unlawful firearm possession. Quinton Rami followed with his own guilty plea in November of 2024, admitting in his plea statement that he had taken a substantial step toward committing an armed robbery, and that in the course of that robbery, his accomplice Daniel Keogh had caused the death of Navjot Singh. Rami was sentenced to 16 years in prison for his role. Daniel Keogh's case took a dramatically different path. Initially charged as a juvenile, his case was elevated to Lewis County Superior Court, where he would be tried as an adult. But before his case could reach a resolution in court, Keogh attempted something that added an entirely new layer of criminal charges to his file. In January of 2025, while being held at the Lewis County Juvenile Detention Center awaiting trial, he took part in a violent escape attempt, which included assaulting members of the detention center staff. By late 2025, with a murder trial looming just weeks away, Keogh's attorney negotiated what is known in Washington state as a bar plea, an arrangement in which a defendant pleads guilty to amended charges without necessarily admitting to every specific factual detail alleged by the prosecution, while still accepting the legal consequences. On January 6, 2026, roughly 3 weeks before his trial was set to begin, Keogh accepted this deal, agreeing to plead guilty to amended charges of second-degree murder, second-degree unlawful possession of a firearm, and first-degree escape, the latter charge tied directly to his attempted breakout from a juvenile facility. As part of the same plea, he also pleaded guilty to 2 separate counts of second-degree assault stemming from his attack on detention center officers during that escape attempt. On February 2, 2026, Daniel Keogh, by then 18 years old, stood before Lewis County Superior Court Judge Toynbee for sentencing. About 18 people were present in the courtroom that day, seated entirely on the side reserved for the prosecution, a silent but telling detail about the community's feelings toward the defendant. For the murder of Navjot Singh, Judge Toynbee sentenced Keogh to a total of 295 months in prison, the equivalent of roughly 24 years and 7 months, along with 36 months of community custody following his release, mandatory anger management treatment, and required mental health evaluations. For the separate escape attempt and the assaults on detention center staff, the judge added a consecutive sentence of 43 months, along with an additional 18 months of community custody. The judge also entered a lifetime no-contact order protecting Navjot Singh's family, along with a 10-year no-contact order protecting the 2 officers Keogh had assaulted during his escape attempt. The story did not end quietly even after sentencing. Just 2 months later, In April of 2026, prosecutors filed a new probable cause affidavit alleging that Keogh had been involved in yet another violent incident inside the juvenile facility where he was being held, this time at a facility known as Green Hill School. According to that affidavit, staff members had to physically restrain Keogh after a fight broke out, and while being escorted afterward, Keogh reportedly turned and spat blood directly onto one of the staff members performing his official duties. Finally, in May of 2026, the last piece of the case resolved when Taylor Lenihan, the youngest of the three original defendants, appeared for her own sentencing hearing. Having pleaded guilty years earlier and already having spent significant time in custody, the judge sentenced her to 364 days in jail, but with 547 days of credit already earned for time served, meaning she would serve no additional time behind bars. With Lenihan's sentencing, the case of Navjot Singh's murder, which began as a simple robbery inside a small-town gas station, finally reached its conclusion for all three teenagers involved, one facing over 2 decades in prison, one serving 16 years, and one walking free having already served her debt. Number 8. Dakota Merritt. A father is stabbed to death inside his own apartment, and the person investigators say did it isn't a stranger who broke in, it's his own 16-year-old daughter, living under the same roof. The case unfolded in the Lomain neighborhood of South St. Louis County, Missouri, on the afternoon of August 17, 2025. At approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, officers from the St. Louis County Police Department's South County Precinct responded to a call for service in the 200 block of Carrington Lane, just a few blocks west of Jefferson Barracks Park. When officers arrived, they discovered 39-year-old Derek Merritt suffering from life-threatening stab wounds inside his own home. He was rushed to a local hospital, but his injuries proved too severe, and he was pronounced dead shortly after. Investigators moved quickly, and that same day, a 15-year-old suspect was taken into custody. Dakota Merritt, Derek's own daughter, who at the time was held by the St. Louis County Family Court on juvenile charges of second-degree murder and armed criminal action. According to the probable cause statement filed by prosecutors, the investigation determined that Dakota had stabbed her father, though further details of what led to the confrontation have not been made fully public. For roughly 8 months, the case moved quietly through the juvenile court system while prosecutors worked to build the evidence necessary to have Dakota certified to stand trial as an adult, a legal process required in Missouri before a minor can face adult criminal charges for a violent offense. That process concluded on April 21, 2026, when the St. Louis County Family Court formally certified Dakota Merritt, by then 16 years old, to be tried as an adult. The St. Louis County Prosecuting Attorney's Office issued formal charges that same day, 1 count of second-degree murder and 1 count of armed criminal action. Following her certification, Dakota was ordered held on an unusually strict bond, $300,000, cash only, with no 10% option available, meaning her family would need to produce the full amount in cash rather than the more common practice of posting a smaller percentage through a bail bondsman. The case, which had drawn heavy attention from local news outlets from the moment officers first responded to Carrington Lane, generated extensive footage of the active forensic crime scene as investigators processed the family's apartment complex in the hours and days following the killing. Community reaction to the case has been notably muted compared to some of the other cases on this list, in part because so few details about a possible motive have been made public. What is known is that this occurred inside what officials described as a middle-class residential area not accustomed to this level of violence, and that the relationship at the center of the case, a daughter accused of fatally stabbing her own father inside the home they shared, has drawn comparisons to several of the other parricide cases that make up this list. As of this recording, Dakota Merritt's case remains pending in St. Louis County Adult Criminal Court, with her trial yet to be scheduled. Court records and local reporting have been careful to note that, as with any pending case, the charges against her remain accusations only, and she is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in a court of law. It stands as one of the more recent and still unresolved cases in this entire list, a stark reminder that some of these stories are still being written in real time. Number 9. Jonathan Estrada. A father in his mid-40s would never call this next case's shooter a teenager. He was 18 years old on paper, but everything about how this crime unfolded reads like the reckless, split-second rage of a kid who had no idea what he was about to take from a family driving home for the night. The crime occurred on the evening of June 2, 2025, near the intersection of Solano Drive and Spruce Avenue in Las Cruces, New Mexico, a city in the southern part of the state not far from the Texas border. According to investigators and family accounts, the incident began as an ordinary act of aggressive driving that spiraled into something far worse. A white mid-size sport utility vehicle, later identified as being driven by 18-year-old Jonathan Estrada, aggressively tailgated a family's car, flashing its headlights in an apparent attempt to intimidate the driver. The family's driver, described by relatives as scared throughout the encounter, attempted to get away, turning at one point beneath a bridge near the intersection. As the traffic light turned green, prosecutors say Estrada opened fire, shooting 5 times directly into the family's vehicle. Riding in the backseat that evening was 14-year-old Alejandro Roman, who according to his family had been asleep at the time, simply riding home like any other night. One of the 5 shots struck and killed him. Another shot reportedly grazed the head of a different family member who had been sitting in the backseat alongside him. In a detail that became one of the most heartbreaking symbols of the case, investigators later revealed that when Alejandro died, he still had a small toy Hot Wheels car tucked in his pocket, a reflection, his family said, of a boy who had a genuine passion for cars. Alejandro's older sister, Isabella Roman, would later describe the terror of that night to local news reporters, explaining that the other driver had been trying to hit their vehicle from behind, flashing lights, while her family member behind the wheel was simply frightened and trying to get away. She recounted how, the moment their car turned beneath the bridge and the light changed to green, the gunman fired 5 times into their vehicle, killing her little brother in the backseat. In the immediate aftermath, Las Cruces police withheld the suspect's identity from the public for several hours as the investigation got underway, before eventually confirming they were searching for 18-year-old Jonathan Estrada. What followed was a prolonged, multi-month manhunt. The Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives eventually offered a $5,000 reward for information leading to Estrada's capture, as the Roman family pleaded publicly and repeatedly for the community's help in finding their son's killer, with Isabella and other relatives giving numerous interviews expressing their grief and their desperation for justice. Finally, on September the 25th, 2025, nearly 4 months after the shooting, Las Cruces police located and arrested Jonathan Estrada at a business on the city's north side, where investigators said he had been employed the entire time the manhunt was underway. He was taken into custody without incident and held without bond at the Dona Ana County Detention Center, facing 7 felony counts: second-degree murder, 2 counts of shooting at or from a motor vehicle, 2 counts of aggravated assault, tampering with evidence, and a violation of probation from an unrelated prior case. The case took an unexpected turn when it emerged that, even while being actively hunted by New Mexico authorities for Alejandro's murder, Estrada had also been dealing with entirely separate criminal charges across the state line in Texas. On August 5, 2025, while still a fugitive from the New Mexico murder investigation, Estrada pleaded guilty in Texas to 10 separate counts of human smuggling and 1 count of evading arrest, charges that stemmed from an unrelated incident back in 2023. Back in New Mexico, the murder case moved toward resolution nearly a year after the killing. In July of 2026, Jonathan Estrada, by then 19 years old, accepted a plea bargain, pleading guilty to second-degree murder while prosecutors agreed to dismiss his remaining 6 felony counts. On July 17, 2026, he appeared for sentencing in a Las Cruces courtroom packed with spectators, many wearing T-shirts memorializing Alejandro Roman, alongside Estrada's own family and supporters who had also come to be present for the hearing. State District Judge Conrad Perea sentenced Estrada to a total of 23 years in prison, with 5 years suspended, and credit applied for 295 days already spent in jail awaiting trial, resulting in a final sentence of 17 years, 2 months, and 15 days behind bars. The judge noted that because the charge is classified as a serious violent offense under New Mexico law, Estrada's eligibility for reduced time through good behavior credit would be sharply limited, capped at just 4 days per month. Following his release from prison, Estrada will remain on parole for 2 years and under supervised probation for an additional 5 years. The sentence sparked immediate and widespread public outrage, with true crime commentators and members of the public alike expressing frustration that a defendant who fired 5 rounds into a family vehicle, killing a sleeping 14-year-old boy, would potentially be eligible for release after serving close to 17 years. Las Cruces officials and prosecutors, for their part, pointed to the case as emblematic of a broader and deeply troubling pattern the city has been grappling with: an epidemic of gun trafficking and firearm possession among teenagers and young adults that has been repeatedly flagged by community members, prosecutors, and police alike. For Alejandro Roman's family, the case closed with a sentence many felt failed to match the magnitude of what they lost: a 14-year-old boy, riding home with a toy car in his pocket, killed for nothing more than being in the way of a stranger's road rage. Number 10. J.M. Davis. 5 family members. 3 separate crime scenes. 1 targeted killing spree allegedly planned out over text messages between 2 teenagers who called themselves boyfriend and girlfriend, and it happened in the span of about a single week. The case unfolded across East St. Louis, Illinois, a city just across the Mississippi River from St. Louis, Missouri, in July of 2026. According to prosecutors, 16-year-old Jeremiah Davis and his 15-year-old girlfriend carried out a coordinated series of shootings targeting members of the girl's own family across 3 separate locations throughout the city: the Samuel Gompers Homes public housing complex, a residential area near 39th Street and Summit Avenue, and Jones Park. The victims were identified as 74-year-old Patricia May, the girl's grandmother, 49-year-old Sherry May, her aunt, 24-year-old Devin May, her cousin, and her own siblings, 21-year-old Quentin Thompson and 25-year-old Shania Thompson. According to charging documents, the killings did not all happen at once. Sherry May was killed first, sometime between July the 5th and July the 7th. Patricia May and Devin May were killed several days later, between July the 11th and July the 12th, allegedly shot together at the Samuel Gompers Homes complex. That same day, Quentin Thompson was killed at Jones Park, and Shania Thompson was shot on 39th Street. 2 additional family members, identified as Tiffany Thompson and Santosha Scott, survived being shot during the same spree, with Tiffany reportedly shot in the neck and Santosha shot in the back. The investigation began after Illinois State Police discovered human remains at the Samuel Gompers Homes complex, setting off an intensive, rapidly unfolding inquiry. Troopers eventually stopped a vehicle carrying both teenagers inside a state park and took them into custody. Investigators say shell casings recovered from the various shooting scenes were traced back to a firearm that had actually been reported stolen by a family member on July the 7th, and that Davis told investigators the girl herself had given him that stolen weapon. The alleged motive, according to court proceedings, centered on long-standing tension within the family. Marcus May, father of the 15-year-old girl, gave a wrenching interview to local media in which he said his daughter had become upset with family members and had plotted the attacks together with her boyfriend, Jeremiah Davis. He stated that he could not offer her any sympathy, telling reporters that she had made her own choice to do this. In that same devastating set of remarks, May revealed the staggering personal toll of the case. He said he had lost a nephew, 2 stepchildren, his own mother, and a sister in the span of a single week. At a subsequent court hearing, prosecutors laid out an even more disturbing layer of premeditation. Assistant State's Attorney Daniel Lewis told the court that investigators had recovered screenshots of social media messages in which the 2 teenagers explicitly discussed killing the girl's family, reading some of those messages aloud in the courtroom, including a message in which the girl stated in blunt terms that they were about to kill her family. Lamarion Smiley, the husband of survivor Tiffany Thompson, gave his own harrowing account to reporters, describing how the couple had allegedly created what he called a list on social media identifying family members to target, and how his own wife had survived being shot 4 times during an attack at Jones Park that killed both Quentin and Shania Thompson, while another aunt was shot in the face. Smiley said the girl had reportedly stood over his wounded wife attempting to finish the job, only to run out of ammunition. One particularly gruesome detail emerged in the charging documents. Prosecutors alleged that after Patricia May, the 74-year-old grandmother, was killed, her right thumb was severed from her body. This allegation led to an additional charge against Davis for dismembering a human body, on top of the core murder counts. In total, prosecutors charged Jeremiah Davis with 12 felony counts, 5 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder, 2 counts of aggravated battery, 1 count of aggravated vehicular hijacking tied to allegations that he forcibly took a 2015 white Chevrolet Traverse, 1 count of unlawful use of a stolen firearm, and the count for dismembering a human body. Because Illinois law automatically confers adult court jurisdiction over 16-year-olds charged with first-degree murder, Davis is being prosecuted entirely as an adult, with the St. Clair County Public Defender's Office appointed to represent him. At his initial court appearance, Judge Sarah Rice, describing the details presented by prosecutors as a horrifying sequence of events, ordered Davis held in custody pending further proceedings. His 15-year-old girlfriend's case is proceeding along a separate legal track. Because she was only 15 at the time of the killings, her case began in the juvenile court system, even though it includes charges of first-degree murder. Prosecutors have formally requested that her case be transferred out of juvenile court and into adult criminal court, a request that remained pending as of this recording, alongside continued juvenile delinquency proceedings against her. As of this recording, both defendants remain in custody, with neither case yet having gone to trial. It stands as the most recent case on this entire list, and in many ways one of the most disturbing, a plot allegedly hatched not by outsiders or strangers, but between 2 teenagers in a relationship, targeting one of their own families with a stolen gun, a shared social media plan, and a level of calculated cruelty that shocked even a city no stranger to violence. That brings us to the end of all 10 cases on this list, a collection of stories spanning teenage shooters, parricide, road rage, mass family killings, and crimes carried out by children as young as 12 years old. If this deep dive into these 10 verified cases held your attention, do us a favor and hit that like button. Drop a comment telling us which case you want covered in even greater depth in a future episode, and subscribe to Midnight Cold Case so you never miss when we publish the next one.